Okay, thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm Steve McInerney. I'm the Executive Director here at POMAD. We're excited today to having an event looking at Qatar. Qatar is a country that's mentioned a lot, but we're going to try to examine some issues, some aspects of Qatar, both domestically and in terms of its broader regional role and foreign policy. Hopefully hit on some aspects that are maybe not as often discussed in this town. I'll start with sort of a quick kind of personal note from myself. My own career in the Middle East and North Africa sort of began when I moved to Qatar 20 years ago last month in 1999. I spent 2 years teaching in Doha from 99 to 2001. And at the time, it's sort of fascinating to think now how much has changed in many different respects. When I moved to Qatar in 1999, almost no Americans had ever heard of Qatar or knew that the country existed. Before I moved to Qatar, I was working out at Stanford University, and in the 3 months between accepting the job in Qatar and moving there, I told more than 100 friends and colleagues that I was moving there. And exactly one of them had ever heard of the country before, at that time in 1999. And I bought a sort of travel guidebook to the Arabian Peninsula. The section on Qatar was about 5 or 6 pages long, and it began by saying that Qatar is perhaps a country best known for being unknown, and that was something that many of the local Qatari citizens found amusing. And fast forward now, kind of 20 years later, and it's a very different story. At the time that I moved to Qatar in 1999, the Qatari regime was sort of in the early stages of a sort of concerted effort to change that, to assert for Qatar to assert itself on the international stage and no longer be unknown. This began with sort of rather soft diplomatic efforts to host the WTO, to host sporting events. I remember when I was living in Qatar, they were awarded the Asia Games in 2006, which was seen as big news and sort of paved the way for them to bid for the World Cup, which they will host in 2022. And now I think I found it interesting in putting this event together. It's no longer is Qatar a sort of small unknown country in the Gulf, but it's actually a country one of the countries that sort of sparks strong opinions and passions here in Washington D.C. And that's quite a change. And in some sense, it's the regime's campaign, its sort of long-term strategy of asserting itself on the international stage and becoming a player and becoming well-known has been wildly successful. But with that success has also come sort of difficulties and challenges and pitfalls. And as everyone here is well aware, there's obviously been a sort of strong split and kind of division in the last few years. There's been a blockade in place against Qatar since 2017. Qatar has been perceived as sort of, part of this kind of bitter divide. And although there's some possibility, some recent hints that could be changing in some ways, and I think we'll try to hit on that during this discussion today. I did want to also just make a quick note or two about the event. In mentioning that sort of Qatar is a country that when you bring it up, it sort of sparks kind of strong passions in Washington. In putting this event on, and since we sent out the public announcement of it, we've had come under some criticism and some accusations that this event must be funded by Gulf governments, which I can clearly definitively say is not the case in any way. And accusations about kind of the makeup of the panel and the objective of the event. And I would just say that that this event, our goal for this event is the same as it is for other events that we have on other topics, other countries, to try to help inject debates and discussions here in Washington with some additional information. And we've done the best that we can to have what I think is a really excellent panel of experts who have different sort of specialties in terms of expertise of the Gulf and of Qatar in particular, each of whom I think will kind of be able to provide information that we hope all of you will find useful and insightful. And we're really happy to partner with Human Rights Watch in putting on today's event. One more note before I introduce our panelists for today. I mentioned kind of this kind of long-running campaign that I kind of lived in Doha during the early stages of. And part of that also was to sort of put forth an image of Qatar as a sort of more progressive and more modern state in some respects than some of its neighbors. In 1999, Qatar had its first elections for the Central Municipal Council. I believe these were the first elections in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula in which women had full right to vote. And at that time, when I was living in Qatar, there was also promise that these elections would be followed by national legislative elections within a few years. A few years later, there was a constitution passed and overwhelming by referendum, and the constitution called also for national legislative elections, which have been scheduled in 2006 and then postponed until 2009 and postponed to 2011, and we're still waiting for those elections to take place. And so I think one thing that we'll try to hit on a little bit today is sort of some of the reasons why some of the promise of kind of reform and modernization and genuine democratization to some degree that has been promised, why has not moved forward in the ways that some might have hoped a number of years ago. So I'm really excited to be able to introduce today's panel. First, I'll introduce Andrea Prasow, who's the acting Washington director at Human Rights Watch. Second, we have Marty Flax, who's the deputy director and head of the North America office of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in New York. We also have Christian Ulrichsen, who's a fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute at Rice University, and we're happy to take advantage of his presence here in Washington this week. And then David Weinberg, who is the Washington Director for International Affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. So I'm really happy to have the four speakers with us today. I'm just going to start with a few questions to each of the speakers, and then after that we'll open up for questions from the audience. Andrea, if I could start with you, and as we know, the Al Thani family rules Qatar as an absolute monarchy. How would you characterize the sort of human rights situation in Qatar today? Representing Human Rights Watch, kind of what does Human Rights Watch see as the most important concerns with regard to rights and freedoms in Qatar?
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here, and I'm thrilled that we were able to co-host this. Overall, what we've seen in recent years is that Qatar is very interested in its image in the international community, like other Gulf countries. In some ways, that's good. It's led to a number of promised reforms, specifically with respect to human rights. But overall, what we've seen is a lot of promises with very little action. And I'll go through some of those in detail. But I think that's sort of the overarching message. In some ways, that pushes Qatar to do more reforms and actually take some steps, particularly at the international level. But in other ways, it sort of checks the box, and then they can carry on business as usual. So one way that this interest in having being seen as a positive actor on human rights at the international stage actually played out with respect to China. Several months ago, China, there was a number of organizations wrote a letter to the president of the Human Rights Council raising concerns about China's policies in Xinjiang. China organized a counter letter. 50 countries signed it, including Qatar, essentially saying everything's fine. The Uyghurs are very happy in their new homes. Don't worry. About a month later, Qatar withdrew its signature from that letter. And I think that had to do with the international community's response and the sort of sense that this view that they would like to be seen as a leader in the international community, and this was an opportunity. So I think that was a helpful sign. It indicates they're responsive to international pressure. But again, at the domestic level, we haven't really seen a great deal of reform. Others will talk about labor and migrant rights in depth, and I'm happy to respond more later on that. But I thought I would touch on a few other related or other human rights issues. Since the Gulf crisis, one of the things that we've documented is the effect that crisis has had on people's ability to exercise and enjoy their human rights, even within limitations that may already exist under the law. So rights to education, to health, to being with your family, those have been severely compromised by the crisis, and we haven't seen significant steps taken by Qatar to alleviate those challenges. One bright spot was the residency reform. So in response to the crisis, Qatar announced a change to residency laws, but it's really quite limited. So up to 100 people per year can be granted permanent residency status, children of Qatari women who married non-Qatari men. It's a small number, it's only up to 100 a year, and it really does little to change the disparity between women's ability to convey rights to their children and men's ability. And of course, in the end, it's still only permanent residency status, which does bring all of the sort of necessary rights into play, but it's not a citizenship. Another issue that we've continued to be concerned about is statelessness. There are a number of people in Qatar, the number is unknown, whose citizenship was stripped nearly 20 years ago, members of the Gufran clan. Some members of those families remain stateless, which means they don't have the right to work, they don't have documents to access healthcare, education, to own property, and we've really seen not a great amount of concern from the Qatari government in terms of trying to address this problem. Women's rights in connection with the residency issue I raised, that's only one of the areas where women do not have full enjoyment of their human rights. There is male guardianship in Qatar. People talk about it with respect to Saudi Arabia all the time, and as if that's the only country where those laws exist. They're different, I guess I would say less severe in Qatar, but they exist nevertheless. And women have different rights in marriage, in terms of owning property, different rights in terms of divorce. We've documented the application of the Zina laws, which tend to just inherently be prejudiced against women or biased towards women because, for example, pregnancy is considered proof of zina. Now, we have also spoken to a number of lawyers who've said that they've seen zina offenses convicted in courts, but they haven't seen the sentences carried out, so that's a good sign. It's sort of this, well, the laws are on the books, we should proceed, this is, an offense against Islam, let's make sure we prosecute people, but then the actual sentences from what we've seen, don't seem to be carried out. So I think that is an example of this tension that Qatar is experiencing. It wants to be modern, it wants to be a reformist, it wants to be on the international arena, and yet at home, it's done really very little to amend its laws to really be a modern society. The final issue I'll touch on just briefly is refugee rights. Here again, I've come up with a great thesis because I'm going to keep giving examples that I think satisfy it. So Qatar has the first asylum law in the Gulf. This is wonderful, but we're still waiting for ministerial implementation of the law, and even as it was articulated, it doesn't live up to international standards. So absolutely, it's a huge improvement if it is implemented, if people can actually apply for asylum. We've spoken to some people who have started to try with that process, but even sort of at its maximum implementation from what we've seen, it still wouldn't meet international standards. So Qatar is certainly interested in taking steps towards reform. I think we'll hear a similar view with respect to the labor and migrant rights, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, thanks very much. Marty, if I could turn to you, as Andrew just mentioned, major and labor and migrant workers' rights are obviously a very important issue and major concern in Qatar, especially as, something like 90%, as much as 90% of the population are actually non-citizens, foreign migrant workers. There have been, significant problems for a long time in Qatar concerning sort of exploitative treatment, abuse of migrant workers. There have been pledges of certain reforms, including related to Qatar's hosting of the upcoming World Cup. If you could just start by kind of outlining for us what progress has taken place up to now, and what do you see as the major concerns that remain?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for a bit of context, so as the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we are focused on the responsibility of business to respect human rights in their operations and in their supply chains. And although we do that globally, we are particularly focused on places that are high risk, that we consider very high risk. And so for the last several years, we've looked especially closely at Qatar and indeed across the Gulf for these exact reasons that you mentioned, because of that history of abuse and the large number of migrant workers. And we look at it because of really three key risks that we see. One is the that I'll focus mostly on is the geographic risk, which is the human rights risks in the country. Andrea touched on some of those already, and I'll talk a bit more about the labor rights ones. But also to just say that some of the sectors that are really important in the country, particularly construction, are considered very high risk for abuse as well. And of course, we have a very high risk, a highly vulnerable population, which is migrant workers. So you have a situation where you have a high risk geography and not very strong underlying rights system, very high risk sectors that are booming in terms of abuse, and then a very vulnerable set of people who are subject to human rights abuse. So in that context, we have looked, just to give some examples of the issues that we've seen, we track allegations of abuse related to business in a number of places, and particularly ones that name a specific company. And in 2018, we identified, for example, 17 cases in Qatar and UAE, tracked back to specific companies that impacted about 12,000 workers. So this is not a complete sample of all of the abuses that we've seen, but it's just some sample size. And the abuses that we saw most often were related to late payment of wages or non-payment of wages. This is a very common occurrence because of the company has financial problems, or they just neglect to pay their workers on time, and literally people don't have money to buy their necessities. We also see problems with freedom of movement and confiscation of passports. So workers will literally take away the passports of the workers. They'll restrict their movement off of whatever campus or whatever dorm they might be living in if they're in the industrial sector. And then we see situations around hazardous living conditions. So employers are responsible for, in many cases, housing their workers, and the conditions in which they're living in vary widely from company to company. We've also, of course, seen reporting from Human Rights Watch and others about hazardous work conditions, especially given the climate in Qatar and those who work outside. There's been a lot of public reporting on worker deaths around construction of World Cup stadiums and things like that. So we do see that consistent reporting of abuse of migrant workers. Some of you will know in 2017, the government and the ILO signed a technical cooperation agreement to try and address some of these concerns. And so we're just about at the sort of halfway point of implementation of that agreement. Some of our other partner organizations, Migrant Rights and others, have done some good analysis on what has been implemented and what hasn't, and just as we heard from the previous speaker, it's a mixed bag. So we are seeing some progress in some legal reforms. For example, the government has withdrawn the requirement for most workers to get an exit permit to leave the country. Not all workers are now exempt, but many of them are. They've loosened restrictions on requiring workers to get what's called a no objection certificate if they want to change jobs. A lot of workers are still subject to that requirement, and we've talked to workers, and in practice, it's still very difficult to change jobs. And that's really important. I just want to, that may sound like a very small thing, but it's not just a sort of infringement on someone's right to choose where they work, but actually it's a really big disincentive for companies to treat their workers well. If they know the worker can't leave, there's no sort of competition for good treatment, and they need to keep they have very little incentive to treat them well. So that's a really important piece. And especially when you couple that with restrictions on freedom of association and the lack of right to unionize, there's really not a good opportunity for worker voice to actually be heard and their rights to be represented. We did see some really interesting cases, however, about a month ago of migrants actually striking and publicly protesting their lack of payment, which was something we have not seen before. And we were pleased to see that the government did not kind of interfere in those protests, did not break up those protests, let them proceed. And I know the government put out a statement trying to explain how it addressed some of the underlying concerns in one of the cases that the workers were protesting. So I thought that was really interesting and potentially positive, but obviously we're still not seeing the kind of fundamental freedom of association rights. And then just lastly, right to remedy. So anytime there's an abuse or a risk of abuse, you want systems in place for people to get remedy for that. And the government has, through this agreement, put in place a labor dispute resolution committee where workers are supposed to be able to, without fear of retribution, hear their complaints in a timely manner. Some cases have worked through that system. Others are still taking much too long, or the kind of cases that involve a lot of workers, they're having a hard time navigating that. There's no class action option there, then of course there's no collective bargaining or union, and so it's very difficult to navigate those cases. They've also put in place kind of an insurance scheme to try and address these cases where workers aren't paid. That's getting slowly off the ground. So we're making some, as I said, some progress in some areas, and I think we've still got a ways to, some opportunities, progress still yet to be made in others.
Okay. Thanks. David, I'd like to turn to you. In addition to kind of these issues of labor and migrant rights, another issue for which Qatar has often drawn international criticism, including here in the United States, is not doing enough to curb extremist and intolerant discourse, and even in some cases perhaps sort of actively propagating and encouraging this. How would you describe the current situation on these issues with regard to acceptance and tolerance, or promotion and support for intolerance?
Sure. Thank you to POMED and HRW for having this discussion today and for having this be part of the dialogue. I appreciate it. So the ADL does public polling on attitudes about Jewish people in countries throughout the world. And in the Middle East, it may come as no surprise that in many countries, the rates of anti-Semitic attitudes about Jewish people are very high, according to the metrics and methodology used in this survey. And so when we highlight instances of anti-Semitism in the region, we generally try and focus on instances that are state-enabled or particularly state-propagated, because otherwise I think it's hard to get a sense of instances that are particularly egregious or particularly striking, especially vis-a-vis instances where U.S. policy might come to bear, where the U.S. government might be encouraged to raise this with counterparts. Qatar is one of the most problematic Middle Eastern governments in this regard, unfortunately. It's not as bad as Iran. It's not as bad as the Palestinian Authority or Hamas authorities. It is in some ways similar to Saudi Arabia, in some ways better, and in some ways worse. If you look at state textbooks, for example, that's one of the particularly striking instances. So these are materials that have the stamp of the Qatari government's education ministry on them. And the most recent instance in which we were able to see what appeared to be current Qatari state textbooks for the high school level on religious education materials, it was systematically intolerant towards adherents of other religions. Virtually every anti-Semitic trope that you could imagine was in there, claiming that Jews seek world domination, claiming that they are both simultaneously weak and evil and dictatorial, and basically taking some examples of particular instances from past Islamic theology and history and applying judgments against particular Jewish individuals or groups against the Jewish people as a whole today. It'll be very interesting to see when those high school books are published this year, whether there have been any improvements or not. The textbooks, unfortunately, are not the only dimension, though. So it's a little hard to dismiss it as something that would be perhaps an isolated oversight, and maybe a screw up by one bureaucrat somewhere or something like that. So, for example, if there is such a thing as a regime religious ideologue, it's Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who has had the seat next to the emir at his Ramadan iftar for religious preachers every single year running for the last 5 years. A day after sitting on Emir Tamim's side and being kissed on the forehead by him this Ramadan, he published an article in the Qatari press comparing Jews to apes and pigs. So, some problematic dehumanization there. He is the emeritus head and founder of an international preachers union that is based in Qatar, and which is routinely more hardline on issues of religious tolerance than counterpart organizations in other parts of the Gulf and other parts of the region. and his successor as head of that organization, when Al Jazeera got in hot water recently for propagating something that engaged in Holocaust denial or distortion, followed up on it by encouraging everybody to question or distort the truth of the Holocaust. He portrayed it as try and find the real truth, but he was basically dismissing established facts about the established genocide of the Jewish people. There are a lot of other examples as well. I'm happy to get into in Q&A, but I won't go on here. Just a couple of what, name checking them: state-sponsored book fair, private media outlets that routinely violate state laws about defamation of other religions, but have no penalties when they do so vis-a-vis Jewish people, as well as problematic content routinely aired on the state-owned Al Jazeera, or preachers who are routinely invited back to the state Grand Mosque or Education City Mosque in spite of their record of continuing to say these sorts of problematic things off the podium and sometimes even on the podium.
Thanks, David. Christian, turning to you, I'd like you to sort of help us understand the existing political dynamics in Qatar. Of course, Qatar is an absolute monarchy, but despite that, there, in all absolute monarchies and all dictatorships, there are nonetheless sort of important political dynamics at play. How would you describe the political dynamics? To what degree have they changed, for example, since Tamim became the emir in 2013? I mentioned, the regime's sort of repeated promises to have elections for 2/3 of the seats of the legislative council, as is required by the Constitution. How would you describe kind of their motivations for not moving forward with those? How do you see the prospects for some of these sort of long promised reforms moving forward in the period ahead?
Well, thank you for having me on this panel and for putting it together. What I'd begin with is we've heard a lot in the last few years about the generational shift in the Gulf, the rise of these young, new leaders who are reshaping Gulf politics. And of course, it began to some extent with the handover of power in Qatar in 2013, when Sheikh Hamad abdicated and handed power to his son, who was 33 at the time. And the was pretty unique. And I think it was consistent with the support that Sheikh Hamad had given to younger movements sweeping away sort of older established regimes elsewhere in the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, giving youth a chance and giving his son the opportunity to stamp his own authority on Qatar, which we've now seen in Saudi Arabia following suit to some extent with Mohammed bin Salman. So that generational shift has really begun in 2013 in the Gulf. We now see that being replicated to some extent elsewhere. Another thing to note is from the very beginning, Tamim was under pressure from his neighbors. Tamim took power in June 2013, and the first instance of pressure from the UAE and Saudi Arabia began about 6 weeks later in July. So from the very beginning, Sheikh Tamim's time as Emir of Qatar has been shaped by a sustained power play, or whatever you would call it, from Qatar's regional, or at least some of Qatar's regional neighbors. And this has shaped decision-making and has shaped policy responses as well. And it's been a fact of life since pretty much the very beginning. We had a first instance of a diplomatic rift in 2014. And then, of course, since 2017, we've had the blockade of Qatar by 3 neighboring states plus Egypt. So it's been a fact of life since the very beginning of his emirship. During that time, Sheikh Tamim has very largely replaced the old guard, the sort of generation of ministers and senior decision makers. Senior decision makers that had grown up in positions of authority under Sheikh Hamad. So some of the allegations and accusations against Qatar since 2017 that the old guard remains in place are, in my views, quite misplaced. We've also seen, I think, an attempt to try and learn the lessons of Qatar's policies in 2011, 2012 in other parts of the Middle East, when their public diplomacy was often lagging. You will see Qatari action, or at least Qatari support for various groups, without necessarily an explanation of what they were doing and why they were doing it. And we've seen, especially since 2017, a ramping up of public diplomacy, of at least the acceptance that you need to explain yourself to an international audience in a much greater way than hitherto. The blockade has been interesting in the sense that one of the perhaps unstated objectives was to try and weaken the Al Thani royal family, ruling family, and to try and create a wedge between the family and the population, citizens plus expatriates. And that's really had the opposite effect. The Al Thani historically have had a history of successions that have to some extent been contested, most recently in 1995, but the family today is probably more unified than at any previous point. You know, the external pressure has drawn them together, not driven them apart, and that's been an interesting, if unanticipated by the blockading states, side effect. We've also seen the beginnings of a Qatari national identity and nationalism beginning to really emerge, again under pressure from external factors. Of course, the image of Sheikh Tamim, some black and white image, has gone all over, viral in sense, all over Qatar, but also in poetry and in song, in theatre productions. There's a whole range of sort of almost a sort of flowering of expressions of national identity, which is quite interesting to watch. And actually in some of the rhetoric at least, and this perhaps also feeds into some of the policy decisions that have been announced, if not fully implemented so far, we've also seen to some extent an erosion, or at least a partial erosion, of the barriers in the gulf between citizens and expatriates, in the sense that those who have been at least in Qatar since 2017 have had a feeling of being all in this together. You know, the blockade didn't necessarily distinguish between citizens and residents in its impacts. You know, the borders were shut, or at least the Saudi land border was shut. And certainly some people at least have started talking about sort of a notion of we're all together in this. It's not necessarily transferring into policy reforms as quickly as, again, some people on this panel may wish, but it's still a rhetorical shift, which I think is quite interesting in a part of the world where that distinction had always been very rigid. You do see the beginning of the erosion of that. And so I think that will be interesting to watch. Yes, of course, as you said, the elections have been sort of repeatedly put on the back burner since 2003. And I mean, I think it probably looks like 2019 is becoming, or is running out of time. So I suspect the council may be reappointed for another 3 years. Again, in the Gulf, people often look at the example of Kuwait and say we need to learn from their issues and try and find a way that works. Now, that's not justifying necessarily endlessly putting it off, but there was many reasons why. And I think in Qatar, at least among Qatari citizens, there's not necessarily a huge demand for kind of elections. I mean, we've seen turnout, as in other Gulf countries, in municipal elections. It hasn't been huge. There's not necessarily that kind of bottom-up pressure for these elections to take place, and so with that absent, it's perhaps easier just to maintain the status quo.
Maybe we'll come back on some of these in just a moment. Marty, if I could ask you a follow-up, and thanks very much for your kind of helpful kind of overview of the situation on regard to labor rights and foreign migrant workers. If I could ask you to put the situation in Qatar for migrant workers sort of in context, in regional context, and these issues are very similar in many of the other Gulf states. Kind of, how would you kind of compare the treatment of migrant workers in Qatar and any of the sort of reforms or changes or lack thereof with some of its neighbors in the Arabian Peninsula?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we really do try and focus on the Gulf as a whole, and particularly we've dug into Qatar and UAE in part because of the big upcoming international events that are there. And I'll talk a bit about, of course, the elephant in the room on labor rights is the World Cup. But I think, what we see across the board in many of these countries and even beyond the Gulf in the Middle East is the underlying legal structures around migrant workers workers are very similar, right? The kafala system is implemented in a lot of countries in different ways. So the kinds of abuses that we see are very similar from country to country. And they're similar because the legal structure is similar and the sectors are similar. The risks in construction, for example, that we see around the world. So, the delays and non-payments of wages and the restrictions on movements and seizures of passports, the payment of recruitment fees by workers in order to get the job in the first place, to often unscrupulous recruitment agencies in their home countries, unsafe working and living conditions. These are similar to what we see in other countries in the Gulf and indeed in the broader Middle East and in some other places where migrant workers are also working. I think what's really interesting about Qatar in this moment, though, is the opportunity of the World Cup. And that has, I think, created a space, that and the kind of ILO agreement has created a space for dialogue with the government that hasn't really existed, and kind of kick-started some conversations around reform. So we do see a level of maybe opportunity there that we don't see in the same way in other places. And so you start to see things like reforms to some labor laws, at least on paper. The FIFA now has human rights guidelines that apply to operations in Qatar, in part because of the fact that they awarded the games to Qatar. The Qataris' own Supreme Committee on Delivery and Legacy, which is responsible for organizing the World Cup, has adopted its own worker welfare guidelines because of this dialogue. So you do kind of have that evolution of discussion in Qatar that isn't necessarily happening at the same level elsewhere, which is welcome.
Thanks. Andrea, you mentioned the issues of the status of women in Qatar, and you mentioned the guardianship law, which gets, as you noted, gets much more attention next door in Saudi Arabia. If you could just expand a little bit more about, tell us a little bit more about how you see the status of women in Qatar in terms of their political, social, economic rights, and again, to what degree you see hope for improvement in that regard.
Yeah, the guardianship law, again, as I said, is a little less extreme than the Saudi version. It applies to women under 25, and married women can travel. Their husbands don't need to give them permission, though their husbands can stop their travel. They don't need the affirmative permission, but they can take action to stop it. What we don't see, which doesn't mean they don't exist, are these sort of prominent cases you see coming out of Saudi, women desperately trying to flee, the use of apps to control their whereabouts and so on. But the personal status laws are really where we see a lot of the challenges for women's rights. And the Gulf crisis has highlighted that because of the family separation issue. There are people who are torn apart from their families in part because their children don't have their nationality. So they're living elsewhere. They may be living with their father in another Gulf country, and the mother can't see them. We see awards, even though under most interpretations of Islam, the children are supposed to remain with the mother upon divorce. Frequently, custody is given to the father. Women just clearly inherit 50% of what men inherit through the inheritance laws. So it's that large set of the personal status laws where we see the most significant challenges facing women. And as I mentioned at the outset, the reform that we saw with respect to the residency for the children of Qatari women who had married non-Qatari men is really the sort of token gesture. It no doubt affects individuals who suddenly have the ability to enjoy their rights that they didn't before. It's not that it's insignificant, but it doesn't really address the root of the problem, which is that women are treated as less than men in really all levels of Qatari law and practice.
Thanks. David, if I could ask you to just describe for us how you see the situation for religious freedom in Qatar, both for Qatari citizens and also for the large expatriate community in Qatar, including the large sort of non-Muslim expatriates.
Absolutely. I think it's an interesting case study, right? Because it's, on the one hand, you have this sort of state-provided authorization, basically, or tolerance toward intolerant speech on state fora. And on the other hand, you have state-supported promotion of religious freedom and religious engagement and religious diversity in some notable ways. So, for example, there are 8, as of the most recent State Department reporting, there are 8 recognized Christian churches in Qatar. They operate in the Mysamir complex, which is it's referred to as Church City. there are there's tolerance but not authorization for non-registered religious communities to worship as well in private settings only, including Hindus, Buddhists, Baha'is, Jewish people, etc. The challenge is sort of when these two intersect, right? So when the state sponsors or a proto-state entity hosts an ongoing series of religious discourses and dialogues, and some of the most prominent clerics in the state refuse to go, or when you have the first Maronite church in the region in the Gulf laying a headstone at a place laying the cornerstone for a new church at a place where certain churches can be built and others can't. One other, I think, really striking one is the Qatar Foundation's Education City campus. So it's they host a regular summit on education and women's empowerment and children empowerment. They have these 6 satellite U.S. campuses, as well as several other international university campuses and other international research institutions or other scholarship institutions. And the mosque that's set up on the site to service all of the Qatar Foundation institutions, the Education City Mosque, when it was inaugurated in 2013 with the Emir's, I believe it was after Emir took over, so it was the Emir's mother in presence, several ministers in presence. The guest speaker who was brought in was someone who had a record of saying bin Laden died with more dignity than any Christian or Zoroastrian or Jew or other non-Muslim because he died a Muslim. And someone who said that women are merely an ornament to men. There have the speakers who are hosted at this mosque, not consistently, but very, very many times are preachers who have a long record of incitement against non-Muslims. And yet this is a facility that the state, through the Qatar Foundation, routinely gives people tours of as a sort of a showcase of its contribution to religious tolerance and dialogue. And there have been at least 2 instances in which sermons delivered at that mosque's pulpit, which, by the way, are directed at all of the U.S. universities. So, like, there's a shuttle that takes students from, Northwestern University, Qatar, to this mosque, and they're, the newspaper for the facility encourages them to go to this. And there have been sermons at this mosque in which the preacher has preached that God should destroy the infidels wherever they are. And this is in a place where the term infidel is clarified in state textbooks to mean anybody who's not Muslim. So that, there's some real tensions here. It's, like some of my co-panelists have said, there are areas where there are positive developments, there are areas where there are shortcomings. And I mean, I think it's perhaps most telling if you're a Shiite Muslim in Qatar and you're reading state textbooks that say that you're going to hell. It's different than what non-Muslims are subjected to in the education system there. But it's, it's certainly harmful.
Thanks. Christian, let me turn to you before we open up to questions from the audience. You mentioned just a moment ago in sort of explaining some of the similarities in the political dynamics in Qatar and some of its neighbors and some of the reasons that there's been maybe not as much reform as some of us would like to see, not as much political change. One area in which, of course, Qatar has distinguished itself from many of its neighbors is in terms of foreign policy. It's been much more assertive and independent in its foreign policy in ways that in some instances have attracted the ire not only of its neighbors but of some here in Washington. Its approach to foreign policy has included engaging with a lot of actors widely viewed as unsavory and in some instances actors that are considered terrorist organizations by the U.S. government, such as Hamas. There's been a lot of news this week about the sort of collapse of talks with the Taliban, which Qatar had played a key role there as well. I'd like you to try to kind of just describe kind of the connections between domestic political factors, kind of how would you explain its its independent and kind of different approach to foreign policy, and kind of why has it adopted a different approach from its neighbors?
Well, I think here we see one of the lessons that the Qatari government absorbed from 2011-12, where both with Hamas and the Taliban, for example, you mentioned those two examples, the Qataris have engaged in hosting dialogue between the Taliban. Well, they've had a Taliban office in Doha since 2010 in various guises, and on-off series of meetings with various officials since 2013-14. And of course, they ramped up in 2018 when President Trump called for direct negotiations between US officials and the Taliban, which now seem to have reached a sort of denouement of sorts. But all of that was done with full coordination with the US. It wasn't freelancing in any way. And the irony is that the UAE also was trying to secure the hosting of that office, and were quite put out, it seems, when the office was based in Qatar rather than the UAE, to the extent that in 2017 it became one of the issues that the UAE tried to portray the Qataris as being this sort of rogue state by having the kind of Taliban representatives in Doha, even though that was very far from the truth. And again, you see the institutionalization, at least, of working with foreign partners, with the US, with the Taliban negotiations, also in terms of with Hamas in Gaza, with working to coordinate payments to Gaza through Israel, through the US. And again, learning the lessons of 2012, when, for example, Emir Hamad at the time went to Gaza and promised a lot of reconstruction support. But nowadays that support is channeled through institutional mechanisms in coordination with regional and international partners. So again, learning those lessons of a freelancing foreign policy being replaced by a much more coordinated multilateral one to some extent. In terms of foreign policy as well, one of the interesting side effects of the 2014-17 period, in 2014 you had the first iteration of this row in the Gulf, when the Saudis, Bahrainis, and the Emiratis withdrew their ambassadors for 9 months. After that, the Qataris actually really did make steps to try and return to a GCC consensus in many ways. They ramped down a lot of their support they coordinated much more with Saudis on Syria policy in 2014-15. They really became less activist in Libya at a time when the UAE was also ramping up its own activity in support of Khalifa Haftar in Libya. And they sent troops to Yemen, or at least to the Saudi border, to join a Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And if you now look at that from a perspective of post-2017, what I think has stung the Qataris most is that even though they made, in their view, attempts to return to a GCC consensus, that did not prevent what happened in 2017. And so that, I think, has shaken the Qataris. That, the problem now going forward is rebuilding ties of trust and mutual confidence. And in their views, they made attempts to learn the lessons from the 2011-12 period and to return to a GCC fold that perhaps their neighbors thought they had somewhat departed from, but to no avail. And I think the lesson also, as I said, has been that you have to coordinate policies with partners to make sure that that sort of stigma of why are they doing something, we don't know what its aim is not necessarily repeated.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to open up for questions from the audience. If you could please just briefly identify yourself and wait for the microphone, which is necessary for the question to be heard on the webcast online. We'll start right here. Thanks.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Mr. Weinberg, can you go into a little deeper into the religious prejudices? Is in the textbooks in particular, are you seeing aspersions cast against Baha'i, Ahmadiyya, Shia? Does it appear in the textbooks? And is there a temple anywhere in Qatar? or fire temple for the Zoroastrians.
So the most detailed English language resource on what is in Qatari state textbooks was a 50 or 60 page book that was published in the last year by the Middle East Media Research Institute. There are different chapters on a bunch of these different topics. I don't recall seeing information in there specifically about, either in that report or in the books that I've looked at, about Zoroastrians or Baha'is, or Ahmadi Muslims. The Jews, Christians, other non-Muslims, to some extent Buddhists. A lot of it is sort of framed in terms of the division between Muslims and non-Muslims, and around a Salafist religious concept known as loyalty and disavowal. That there's like a very stark division between people who are Muslim to whom you should be loyal and people who are not Muslim to whom you should not be loyal, and you should not show love, you should not show sympathy, you should not be allies. And there are different ways to interpret and to apply this religious concept, but the way in which it's applied in the Qatari state textbooks is very strident, very stark. It teaches that for non-Muslims, unless you have certain extenuating circumstances, such as being a diplomat or being in the Muslim world, majority world for commerce or learning, or having an explicit non-aggression treaty with the Muslim world, that you are a combatant, and that God has commanded Muslims to fight you until you submit to second class. It's somewhat analogous to that. I haven't seen that concept used in that specific argument, but it's that sort of conflictual framework that I think governs a lot of how these relations are discussed in Qatari state textbooks as well as in Saudi state textbooks down the road. As for whether there's there are no registered religious facilities in Qatar other than Muslim ones and Christian ones. Thank you. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Sabiha Khan. I'm a recent graduate from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. My question is about the role of Al Jazeera. I would love to hear more thoughts on it, especially from Andrea, if you think it fits in with the tension you were talking about between projections of modernity versus internal actions.
Andrew, if you'd like to start. And then
That's a good question, and hopefully they'll still ask me to go on it after I answer. I think you're right. I think, and this is not something that Human Rights Watch has studied, but I think we've seen, and David was talking about things that Al Jazeera will put forward. On the flip side, they're very eager for Human Rights Watch's foreign policy analysis all the time, and they broadcast really valuable news around the world. I mean, when I travel, I can actually see what's happening around the world, and I see my colleagues pop up on my television in hotel rooms all the time. So I think they're a really useful news source, but absolutely there are issues related to the agenda and who controls the agenda.
I would just add, so Al Jazeera is described by the State Department as government-owned and partially government-funded in Qatar. It has its own board, but the leadership of Qatar has bragged in government-to-government meetings, according to leaked WikiLeaks purported cables, that it's a tool of the state in some ways, and that they can change its coverage depending on how other governments are interacting with them. The network regularly in Arabic describes as a martyr anybody who is killed in the act of fighting Israelis. Or at the hands of Israelis in general. And so that includes instances in which even the network itself acknowledges people are members of terrorist organizations, in which they're involved in an attack, in which they're involved in an attack within Israel proper, in which they're involved in an attack on civilians explicitly. And so, it creates this environment in which it's glorifying a certain subset of terrorism. And it routinely includes death tolls of Palestinian nationals that cannot be reached unless you're including hundreds or thousands of Hamas and Islamic Jihad combatants, for example, in wars in 2014 and other years. And so it basically is, in some ways, Qatar has learned its lessons from 2011, 2012 in terms of how it approaches things and how it's changed things. But Al Jazeera still is a deeply problematic outlet, especially in the Arabic channel, especially vis-a-vis when it talks about Israelis, when it talks about Jews, when it talks about the United States.
Thanks. Other questions from the audience? Yeah. If you could just we'll wait for the microphone, please, so that people watching online can hear your question. So, yeah. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Wafa Halam. I work with Inside Arabia, but I've attended many conferences of this kind about the Middle East. And one thing that is certain, that I agree with you, that Al Jazeera does tend to portray the victims of Israeli attacks as martyrs. But I think that you can also admit that there is a tremendous amount of bias also in the US media about how they portray the attacks against the Palestinians. And very often, even in the way the terminology of occupied territories is completely overlooked. As a matter of fact, today, I think some of you might be aware that Prime Minister Netanyahu has just pledged openly, and this is again, it has done it before, that he was willing to annex, that he pledged to annex the Jordan Valley, probably as a first step to full annexation. The removal of the Palestinian territories from the State Department archive website is also the current website actually is also problematic in that sense. So yes, you might see bias on one side, but there is also bias on both sides. And finally, I have one more thing for a Christian question.
Was there a question there?
No, I just wanted to say that the bias exists by the fact that it represents a certain population and it addresses a certain population, just as it does on the other side of the issue, just to keep it balanced. On the other side, I wanted to ask you, Christian, about, you mentioned that Qatar had actually sent troops to the border with Yemen, and that they were actually at some point willing to participate in the coalition against in the war in Yemen with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And what happened? Have they participated, and how has been their Qatar's position about the war in Yemen since?
Thank you.
I mean, I'll just maybe make one quick point. I mean, I know this panel is on Qatar, and so the questions are obviously about Al Jazeera. I would also add that the whole regional media landscape has become so polarized as part of this split that, again, we've seen a real problematic, I think, narrative emerging from other regional channels as well, which has magnified many times over the impact of the geopolitical rift. And so that's something that if there's ever a reconciliation, I think we need to have a discussion about regional media on all sides and how they portray certain issues. And it's certainly not just Al Jazeera, and it's become worse in the last 2 years. In terms of Yemen, the Qataris announced they were joining the coalition in September 2015, so several months after the war began, but right after the attack on the base that killed several dozen Emirati soldiers. And Kuwait also announced at the same time they were joining the coalition. To the best of my knowledge, the Qatari troops were deployed, or the troops from Qatar were deployed on the border of Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi from Houthi incursions or to kind of border security. And in fact, about 3 days before the blockade began, the Qatari forces suffered 6 casualties on the border. And then as soon as the blockade began, the Qataris were forcibly ejected from that coalition. So that also stung, I think, the fact that they had taken casualties defending Saudi Arabia from kind of incursion and then being booted out of the coalition within days. To some extent, actually, the blockade has been fortuitous for the Qataris, because over the last 2 years, international condemnation of the Yemen war has escalated, and the Qataris have not been part of that coalition. So in that respect, it has given them much more of a freedom to actually become also more critical themselves of the coalition, rather than having been part of it. And so the timing, to some extent, has been quite fortuitous, that they are not part of that coalition, even as it has now become much more of a political issue in the US and other Western capitals.
Other question? Yeah, here.
Hi, this is Haneen Kirfan. I work with in Saudi Arabia. I just want to address the women's status issue in Qatar and maybe even in the Arab world. I just have a comment and then maybe a question. So despite all the issues regarding women's status in Qatar, at the same time, so many statistics, according to the World Bank and Amnesty International, Qatar has one of the highest rates of women's participation in labor force, about 58% in 2015, and this is a very high rate for women's participation in workforce. According to other issues, such as the issue of citizenship, not passing citizenship to her kids, or the male guardianship, I just want to stress, and maybe you know this, you're aware of this, that this is not even, it doesn't have to do only with the country, it's like more like a religious thing that has to do with Islam. So it's again, it's a Gulf issue, an Arab issue, a Middle Eastern issue. I know that maybe some like other countries in North Africa are more, I'm not gonna say, I don't know, it's like more advanced and different. I don't know if this is the word, but they are in a different level regarding this issue. So don't you think that if Human Rights Watch can actually provide remedy for this on a like broader level, on a more again, like I don't know if I should say like an Arab, considering it's like an Arab issue, and have some more like collective efforts towards providing remedies for this, not only like saying Qatar or Saudi Arabia or even Jordan or Syria or like we have, the list is very long. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, just we're talking about Qatar, so I'm primarily talking about Qatar. The way we focus our advocacy is generally that the entity that has the ability to make the change is sort of our first target. So if the laws are being imposed and implemented by the Qatari government, then our specific recommendations are to them to change the laws. And then we make recommendations to regional bodies, to donor countries, to allies, about, to the UN, different ways to put pressure on the entity that ultimately has that authority. So all of those things are absolutely part of our approach. I'm a generalist. I don't work specifically on the Middle East. We do, the researcher who does most of our work on Qatar also works on the UAE, so she has a broader Gulf perspective. But it hasn't been the case where I've seen, at least coming from an international human rights organization, that we are best situated to have that conversation. I mean, we're happy to support it, and I think our research supports it, but that sounds much more like something that needs to be occurring at the local and regional level that can be supported by other international organizations. Because I think you're right that just talking about, these are the laws inside Qatar and these are the laws over here isn't really addressing the broader issue, which is how people interpret Islam and what that means in the modern world.
Right, because you're aware also that sometimes when governments pass certain laws, sometimes it's not easy to implement. Even like sometimes you can't even force people with a specific mentality to actually accept these laws. So.
And I think the Zina law is an example of that, where it seems there's been some judgment, like, we're not going to do this. This doesn't make any sense, right? But it's on the books, and people get charged, and, families are outraged, and someone has to do something. So people are charged, they're convicted, but then it sort of goes away. We'd like to see the laws change, so that didn't happen at all, right?
Thanks. Yeah, just here behind you. We wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Sam Ruggieri. I have a question for Marty Flax concerning labor issues. You mentioned the recent strike, I think you said maybe about a month ago. I was curious as to whether or not you believe this particular instance is perhaps a flash in the pan, or if there have been any kind of long-term trends that suggest a rise in future collective action amongst Qatari migrant workers, particularly given the publicity with the building of the World Cup stadium?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, it's interesting, as I said before, that these strikes were sort of permitted to happen, once that they happened, they didn't get dispersed in any way. As far as we're aware, the participants haven't faced any repercussions because of that. And in fact, the government came out, as I said, with a statement to try and talk about, at least in one of the cases, what they were doing to address the underlying issue, which is that the workers hadn't been paid for several months. And so, in any situation where, workers maybe see success from that type of action, if they have the opportunity to replicate it, you can imagine that could happen again. I'm not going to sort of opine on the broader political situation to talk about what kind of space there might be for that kind of collective action. But I do think that, there is kind of this period between now and 2022 with the World Cup coming up where there is going to be increasing scrutiny on Qatar, not just in the construction sector where have seen a lot of these cases happen because that's where the money has been going. I think in 2017 it was $8 billion. I think last year was another $6 billion. Of new money in that sector, but also now moving into, for example, the tourism and hotel sector, because you're going to have millions of people coming in for the World Cup, and so there is going to be that kind of scrutiny, and there's going to be that kind of pressure to that kind of attention, which potentially workers could capitalize on. I think also just to mention that some of the home governments of these workers are starting to focus on this issue as well. So workers from South Asia and Southeast Asia, and increasingly East Africa, are going home and telling these stories about what they've experienced, and those governments are now also taking steps, whether it's giving additional guidance to workers before they leave, engaging with the recruitment agencies in those home countries, or even engaging directly with the Qatari government themselves to say, you need to treat these workers, ensure that businesses are treating these workers fairly and appropriately in that country. So I think there's a few avenues of potential action and change that we could see happen in the next few years.
I could just add a quick follow-up question. You talked a lot about kind of the opportunity presented by the World Cup, and which is now 3 years away. Could you talk about the degree to which some of this engagement on all these issues and the scrutiny and such is how much is this being done in a sort of sustainable way, in an institutionalized way, so that in 2022, when the World Cup is over, that that the issue won't lose international attention, or that the progress that's been made won't kind of be reversed.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, right? This can't just be a flash in the pan. We pay attention to this issue for a few more years, and then everyone turns to the next place. And so I think that's where the legal and institutional reform is so important. And so, this agreement with the ILO isn't just about making a few commitments for the World Cup. It's really about changing the laws and then, most importantly, implementation. And so we have some time now to really put the pressure on to get these systems actually sort of churning out results and seeing enforcement of, labor standards and resolution of cases when there's situations that need to be addressed, and kind of longer term, capacity building, if you will, for the workers and the organizations to kind of have the right to have their voice heard, because that's what's going to continue to press for change. And the other thing, too, is just to say, of course, we spend a lot of time focusing also on the role of companies, right? So that even in places where that underlying framework is very weak, as it is in Qatar in terms of labor rights, that doesn't alleviate the company's responsibility to come in and operate in a way that respects human rights. And so, even if those reforms are not fully successful, or there's always going to be gaps in the law or lower standards than we'd like to see, that pressure needs to stay on companies that are operating there to abide by international norms and standards, regardless of what the government asks of them.
Thanks. Other question, Joe?
Hi, Joe Stork, formerly and now once again with Human Rights Watch. But it's been a year or so since I've done any direct work on Qatar, but in talking about scrutiny, it's important to note, I think, that this is not something Qatar has looked for or gone after or allowed, for that matter. And it's become very difficult, even on issues like worker rights, at least the work we were doing, for us to do the kind of have access to the country, have access to the ministries, officials, never mind the work camps that we once had before. And a year or so ago, there was an instance, Christian may remember the details, they had a media center the Qatari government, probably the foundation, I guess, or the Sheikha, had sponsored a free media freedom foundation of some sort. And the initially staffed by Robert Menard of Reporters Without Borders. There was a tiff that he ended up leaving after a year or so. They recruited a very reputable Dutch journalist with a much lower profile who ran it for a couple of years, and then he was eventually fired. And as far as I know, this free media center doesn't even exist anymore. But I mean, the tolerance is not only regarding religious issues or religious differences, but the political tolerance is for all the, and I agree with Andrea, of course, the tensions that she described and their responsiveness has been, well, we encourage that, of course, but they haven't exactly welcomed this, and I think the issue of political tolerance hasn't seriously been tested.
Thanks. Comments or responses to that? But yeah, Sheila, yeah.
I mean, just about, well, the scrutiny issue as well, I think, is one that perhaps wasn't anticipated in 2008, 9, 10 when they were bidding for the World Cup, but of course it comes with the territory. And I think if you remember back to 2013, 14, there were a number of instances of camera crews going off radar and trying to film and getting into trouble and creating additional negative headlines. And I mean, I do think they've learned from that, at least, that you do have to be a bit more open. I mean, it's kind of, it's not perfect by any means, but it is moving, at least in a sort of direction. And of course, between now and 2022, especially once we're past the Olympic Games in Japan next year, it'll be just a focus on 2022. And I think, you know, that it's clearly is going to continue. I mean, this is a major story that newspapers will try to generate headlines from, added perhaps by newspapers in rival Gulf countries who want to try and use this as part of the sort of regional power play that we've seen over the past 2 years. Just the Doha Media Freedom Center was, I think it was 2009, 10 that time. And I think that was an interesting example there, a case study of how an initiative from the top, in this case, Sheikh Moza, just encounters bureaucratic obstacles further down the sort of chain of administrative command. And I think it's, again, an issue perhaps in all Gulf states, not just in Qatar, where, you know, top-down change encounters resistance perhaps at lower levels. And often that's where you see the sort of pressure to try to dilute or to deflect from that change taking effect. And I think that's a problem perhaps region-wide. And again, because it happened in Qatar, you see a kind of Qatar Foundation on the one hand, you know, doing or trying to make that move, but then, you know, the bureaucracy perhaps being slower in moving with it.
Thanks. Other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think perhaps
Just wait for the mic.
Yeah. Yeah, but for people watching online, they can hear you without the mic.
Okay. I feel like one of the deterrent perhaps for faster kind of progress on all those questions is the fact that the Qatari population itself, the Qataris are pretty happy with the status quo. The problem emerges when you see the 2 million workers that add up to, what is it, I think less than 3 million that the Qatari population is. And so that's really, it's perhaps something that we're seeing right now with the migrant population and people who want to come here to work, and, you know, we're not so, you know, we tolerate them. So I do really want to commend Marty and Andrea and David and all of you for the work you're doing, because it is this constant chipping at it, you know, talking about it. And now with the greater spotlight, not just because of the World Cup, I think, but also because there is greater interest. People are using their smartphones to take videos of everything, and we know everything that's happening. And people are more interested in finding out. There is more compassion for the immigrant and the refugees and the women's rights and all of these things. And I think that every single little thing that we do matters and is important, even if it feels like it's so desperately slow. I believe there is an acceleration in consciousness in terms of how people are beginning to perceive those issues. And I think I really want to thank you and very much and commend you for bringing these issues to the forefront, and to you in particular, Stephen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? If I could just also comment a little bit in reaction to that, and also drawing on some of the comments earlier. I think it is undeniably true to some degree that there's not the same level of demand for various types of changes and reforms in Qatar as in some other countries. And to some degree, I think that inherently comes with the wealth in Qatar. Qatar has the highest per capita income of any country in the world, and in general, people who are wealthy and well taken care of are less likely to kind of agitate for change. Having said that, I still strongly do believe that many Qatari citizens, I have many Qatari friends and former colleagues and former students, and I do strongly believe that many of them would like to see positive change in their country in many of the ways that have been addressed today. And many of them are eager to see some of the reforms that have been long promised and not fulfilled. And Christian, you mentioned earlier, sort of as an indicator of lack of engagement or lack of demand for change, the low turnout in elections. And while on one hand that's true, the municipal elections are for a powerless body. And what we've seen across the region and around the world is that the best way for election turnout to increase is for the elections to be more meaningful. And in places like Egypt or Tunisia, when you have elections for relatively meaningless bodies that are not especially competitive, turnout is often in single digits. When there's change and there's competitive elections that matter, that really affect the way the country is governed and the way the government interacts with the citizens, then you often will see turnout increase dramatically, and I think perhaps the same would be the case in Qatar. Is there any other sort of closing comments from our speakers? Okay, in that case, thanks very much for all of you for joining us. Thanks for those of you who've been watching online, and please join me in thanking our four speakers today. So thanks.